Welcome to the latest video in our We See More leadership series. Today we're joined by Duncan Watson, Managing Director, Workplace and Pensions, and Neil Brady, Head of Data Solutions. We will be discussing the issues surrounding data, what tomorrow brings, and the power data has on the future of pension schemes. So how has data played a role in pensions industry over the years?
I think data's always played a role in the pensions industry. It's essential to the running of a pension scheme and paying benefits correctly. But to be honest, it's been treated as a just-in-time commodity, so it's been looked at just when it's needed. It hasn't been looked at proactively as part of an overall strategy.
And I think it's also fair to say that the way in which the industry has progressed over the years, probably more recently as the TPRs start to look at data more, and consumers within the pension industry are demanding more from a data perspective. I think that's driving certain change within the industry around data and the quality of the data that pension schemes and life companies need to hold.
Okay, but is data really that important?
I mean, data's fundamental. It's the bedrock to the running of a pension scheme. Without the correct data, we can't pay the benefits to the members correctly, and we can't do proactive things, strategic things that the trustees and the scheme sponsors might want to do in the future. For example, if they want to engage with their members, display some of that information in an online format without the data in the right place, in the right format, that's just impossible.
Yeah, and I think also the demand that other industry sectors are playing in within the pension industry, consumers really want to understand what they've purchased. And I guess also in later life, understand what that pension contribution means to them, and they need to have access to that information on a more regular basis and as often as possible as required, especially when you're coming up to retirement.
Okay. Looking at past regulations, have lessons actually been learnt from the past with regards to having accurate data?
I think, to be honest, there's been very limited regulation around data historically. So if we go back more than, say, 15 years, it's only in the last 10 years or so that the regulator has really started to take an interest in data and actually ask the scheme managers, the scheme trustees, how good their data is. So I think regulation per se has been a little bit absent in terms of the quality of data. Clearly we've had data protection legislation, which is really focused on the security of the data. There are quality elements to that, but I think as we've seen the regulator's stance in the last couple of years, historic guidance, if you like, has not really been adhered to or taken seriously, and now they're starting to take a stronger view of the quality of data and asking more probing questions.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think also organisations are starting to realise that yes, I absolutely need to have a good data set. The way I view it is that if you're a consumer and you've paid into a pension fund for many, many, many years, surely you have the right to have good quality data, to get a payment correct. And I think organisations have over the recent years have started to recognise that is actually a key factor.
Okay, so we saw some interesting results in the recent Professional Pensions Administration study, when only 25% of respondents believe that the quality of their data will be a hindrance to their ability to deliver future projects. Do schemes truly understand the importance of quality data?
I think there's an expectation gap or an assumption that the data is in the right format, in the right place to actually be able to execute some of those projects. So I think there's an assumption that the data must be of the right level of quality because the administrator is running the scheme quite successfully today. Okay. But I think there's a big difference between having access to the data you need in whatever format and actually having access to digital data to be able to run projects efficiently and successfully. So I think that's where the mismatch in expectation is.
Okay.
I think there's a level of assumption. So if a scheme moves from one administrator to another, or moves from an in-house administration situation to an outsource, there's an assumption from the sponsor and the trustees that project, if you like, that implementation project to move the data and the administration from one place to another is carried out probably more thoroughly than is actually evident in practice.
Right,
Partly
okay.
Because historically there's been a lot of pressure on the fees charged for an implementation project, so providers have pushed their fees down to win business, and the result being that they, I wouldn't say cut corners, but they do that implementation as efficiently as possible and to a minimal extent to be able to run the scheme, and that doesn't necessarily include moving data that might be in a paper format or a scanned format into a digital format so it can be used today.
So is it possible that the trustees and sponsors are not asking the right questions about data as it's being moved around?
Yeah, absolutely. I think The data question, I think, is really an interesting one. So I think, historically we associate data issues with archaic systems.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at, in particular, the auto enrolment marketplace or master trust, there are a number of data issues in that space, and let's face it, that industry's quite new.
Yeah.
So I don't think data is necessarily a historic problem. You could argue we haven't learnt the lessons, despite the fact that we've had these data issues for quite some time now.
Yeah, and I think it's not only the trustees and sponsors that haven't asked the right questions. I actually think the regulator may not be asking the right question now.
Right.
From this year, they've forced trustees and sponsors to talk about the quality of their data in their scheme returns, but they've asked, have you got the rights or the data that's sufficient to run the pension scheme, or it's essential to run the pension scheme? You could answer that question, yes, I've got the data it would take to run the pension scheme. But actually, if it's not on the source admin database, then you can't run projects straight away. You can't run engagement exercises with members, because you've still got to transfer that data from a paper format or a scanned format before you can actually do anything with it. So there's a subtlety in the question there. It's, have you got the data that's essential to run the scheme, and where is it held? I think would be a better follow-on question. And I don't think trustees and actually the regulator are asking that.
Okay, so is it fair to say that there's a difference between the perception and the reality of the data in schemes still?
It's about waking up to what you can physically do with data. The whole purpose of us running this campaign at Equinity is about trying to challenge the industry in some ways to really think hard about the data they're holding and how to use it. I think that's also really important, whether you're a trustee, an administrator, or to some degree a consumer needs to understand what they want from their data as well, and inform the industry about what they want from the data set that they're being provided.
Okay.
I think, sorry, like you made an interesting point earlier. I think it's what the data is being used for. So back to my point at the start about just-in-time data use. So if a member retires or dies or wants to transfer out the pension scheme, that's a just-in-time transaction that the administrator can go and search through the records of that one individual and find what they need to know. So they can process the transaction and in a fairly timely manner for that one individual. An actuarial valuation gets a data extract of the whole scheme, but again, the actuary will make assumptions about that data set, so the result is in the right ballpark. But if you want a mass of data that needs to be processed at a point in time, say 1,000 members that you want to communicate with, all of that data has to be accurate at that point in time, and that has not been a feature of previous administration.
Okay. So how will data be affected ongoing with upcoming regulation, such as GDPR, the GMP equalisation? So looking at the future, how do you think the data is going to be affected?
What I find interesting about, in particular, GMP equalisation piece is that a lot of organisations have spent a lot of money trying to get the data into a fit state. And let us not forget, as soon as that data goes onto the system, the next day it could be out of date. So I think there's a piece for me which is around understanding what controls you need to put in place so you don't find yourself in that situation further down the line when new regulation does come about. Who knows what Brexit is going to be? I mean, that's probably the big unknown in this quantum at the moment. But I do think that organisations probably need to think more about the money they're spending to rectify data, and then what other controls they need in place after they've rectified data. Because I think no organisations want to spend the money twice.
No, absolutely not.
I think GDPR is interesting because on the face of it, I think firms are pretty much should have been doing what they were doing under DPA 98. That hasn't really changed the way firms should be looking after data. I think what it has forced is more questions from trustees and sponsors who'd made an assumption that the data was in a particular place or a particular format, and actually they've started now challenging their providers. Say, well, you show me where you're holding the data. You show me how you're processing that data through your organisation for transactions. So it's prompting different questions or renewed questions that probably haven't been asked either at all before, or certainly not for 20 years or so.
Yeah, indeed.
So it's not the act itself. I think it's just prompted interest and questions. I think future legislation, I think things like IORP 2, which may deem necessary to communicate with all members on an annual basis, or if the pensions dashboard is mandated by the government, again, that will force people to look at where the data is, are there any gaps, what's the quality like, and get the data in a place where it can then be used. So if you like, most legislation, most regulation or guidance is forcing schemes to look at that not just the quality, but where it's actually held and the format.
So Neil, you mentioned Brexit.
Yeah.
Do you have any views on the impact of Brexit on legislation, given that legislation rules are still going to come from Brussels?
A lot of organisations are reluctant to offshore outside the European Union, for example. So if we don't stay as part of that regulatory environment, out of Brussels, and I think we're going to have more challenges face us. So I don't think we've got an option. Personally, I think we've got to, we've got to maintain our compliance to European regulation moving forward. That would be my view.
I think the other point is I suspect pensions is pretty low down on the priority list at the moment for the government in
Yes.
terms of dealing with trade and immigration.
Yeah.
I think those things will dominate.
What will the obstacles for schemes that don't get their data in order sooner rather than later be?
I think for me it's the ability to act on their strategy quickly enough. So if they've got, for example, two examples, a strategy around member engagement, so digitising their information so the members can look and educate themselves on the value of their benefits. If the data's not in the right shape, that just isn't possible. You have to flash a message up saying, sorry, Mr. Smith, your data's not in a format that I can display, or come back in 6 months' time.
Yeah.
The other area is transacting with an insurance company. Many schemes are looking to insure their liabilities by buying in or buying out the benefits of certain elements of their membership. Again, if their data's not in the right state, then that transaction won't be able to happen until the insurer is satisfied that they've done the right level of due diligence on the data, or alternatively charge the trustees a risk premium based on the quality of the data, which could be anything of 5% of the transaction fee. And if you've got a $1 billion transaction, that's a lot of money that is being levied on a data issue.
And I sort of come from the angle from the consumer point of view, as Duncan's just talked about there. I think consumers will start to demand more and want to understand more. And I also think if you think about some of the new technologies out there, blockchain, that type of stuff, that organisations within the pension industry at some point will wake up to and want to use. I think that's going to require a certain data set. So I also think there's a piece around technology that if you've got your data set in the right context, it benefits the consumer, but it also benefits the internal organisation as well, reducing manual processes and so on and so forth. So things become more automated, and I think organisations are waking up to that, but I'm just not sure we're further enough advanced yet.
So that sounds like quite a lot of financial implication to projects. So what would you say to someone or company that says that it's just too expensive and our manual processes have worked in the past and we just want to stay as we are?
I think as an industry we need to do a better job at demonstrating the value or the consequence of not doing it, or the benefit of doing it now, whichever way you want to frame that. Because I think you're right, they can rely on the fact that the scheme runs. And if we want to do a project in the future, we'll stand up a data exercise at that point in time. But I think back to your earlier question, it's about what's the risk of not doing it now. It's the ability to act immediately. It's the reduced risk, if you like, or reputational damage, and it's a cost. And I think data, it's complicated. Some of these schemes are 40, 50 years old. They may have changed providers of administration 3 or 4 times. In that kind of scenario, it's no wonder that data isn't in its ideal state. So it can't be fixed overnight. So actually planning now, starting now, will allow trustees and sponsors to phase the cost, phase the effort over a period of years, rather than be faced with a mad panic at the end when they want to do a transaction or undertake some objective.
Yeah, and I think Duncan's absolutely right. It's not a let's fix it here and now. I think it's about understanding what you want to achieve as an organisation from the data, and that might be a 5-6 year plan. But understanding the building blocks you need to put in place to get the right desired outcome for you as an organisation is really important.
And where do you see Equinity fitting into the data landscape?
I think Equinity is uniquely placed to, if you like, to look at the whole data set from both an operational administrative perspective, but also from a technology perspective, because we have both. We have ability to understand the software that uses the data, but we also understand the consequences of not being able to run the scheme properly. So I think we can look at it from both angles very holistically, and we have the skill set, certainly in Neil's team, to look at data projects in the round and the whole.
Yeah, and I would probably point to the more recent thing we've done with some in the banking industry around Tell Us Once. So there's a service which is quite available in the civil service today, but we've launched a new product that enables banks to have a very similar service offering. When you're going through that very difficult time, walk into your bank. We've built the tools, we've connected the technology to enable consumers to tell us once about a situation and it's resolved, rather than going through the heartache of telling multiple organisations. So I think we've already got examples where Equinity are using the technology they have access to across the group to enhance data and use data in the right way for the benefit of the consumer and the right outcome from an organisational perspective, in particular from a member or customer experience point of view.
I think the other thing, we can take a data strategy or a data project right the way from the start, from the analysis phase, all the way through to the end point, which may be communicating with individual members about what might have changed with their data, the implications in terms of their benefits, any loss or reclaim or redress that we need to make. So we can hold the trustees or the sponsor's hand right from the start, right to the end. We're not just going to step in and step out at different points of the project or the cycle. So it's a holistic support mechanism.
Well, Duncan, Neil, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fascinating topic. It's clear that data is going to underpin the future, and I think the message is very clear to get your data in order now so that you are ready for the future.